Ciao everyone and welcome to episode 11 of Voices of Italy Beyond la Dolce Vita. Today's episode is particularly in line with the general mission of this podcast of telling you guys everything I can about modern Italy, how Italians really are today beyond the clichés and the stereotypes that you may see online. But in this episode, I wanted to take on with you 5 of the most common myths about Italian identity and Italians, from pasta to the way we live our dolce vita. We'll break down together what's real and what's kind of closer to fiction. You hear my take on each stereotypes, some of my personal experiences, and I'll challenge you to think, how do these ideas shape how we see Italy and Italians today? Now just chill, relax, and get ready to learn something that you probably didn't know before about Italian identity. Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia. Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. Okay, I'm gonna start with what's basically the king of the stereotypes and the cliches about Italians, which is Italians eat pasta every day. Let's start with saying that we eat quite a lot of pasta. That's not so far from the truth, and it's undeniable. But you know who else does? A lot of other countries. According to the Statista Global Consumer Survey in 2021, Italians saying that they regularly eat pasta are 83%, but French people are just below at 80%. So that's something that definitely doesn't pertain just to Italians. Then you need to go to the UK to see a 72%, and in the USA we have a 62%. So yeah, we eat pasta quite often and regularly. The Italian Food Union estimates that every year each Italian person eats in average 23 kilos of pasta. So to be fair, to me, that sounds kind of low, but that's because it makes me think about my family. And when I do think about my family, I remember a household where my mom was cooking pasta. Yes, basically every day. And that was really the norm. I never really thought that there was something weird about it. Of course, it also doesn't mean that we were eating tomato sauce spaghetti every day. We were eating lots of different things every day. My mom was just switching formats and sauces and was using, whatever she had home to make pasta, essentially, because just like rice, you can make pasta with millions of different condiments, and there's so many formats and combinations that it's really just actually an easy, lazy, everyday kind of meal when it comes to pasta. And just to be clear here, nothing against something simple like pasta with tomato sauce, but for the foreigners out there who think that that's some sort of Italian delicacy, it's actually considered a quite basic dish, especially if you buy a ready-made tomato sauce to make it, unless you're doing a whole fresh tomato sauce with fresh tomatoes and maybe spring, and the tomato, is fresh and tastes all in another way. Otherwise, it's kind of considered like a child restaurant dish. Spaghetti with tomato sauce. And everyday pasta eating, how that looks like depends on the region that you're talking about. There are some pasta shapes that are definitely more common everywhere, basically in Italy, just like spaghetti, and fettuccine. But others are really more local and sometimes even difficult to find in certain regions. Each region has kind of its own special shapes and sauces that are usually traditionally combined together, like trofie with pesto in Liguria. And in my case, in Sicily, there's this typical Sicilian pasta shape called anellini. Oh my god, they're like small rings of pasta, literally, and they are usually baked with ragu. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. I really love those. But here where I live, for example, in Torino, on the opposite side of the country, I don't necessarily find anellini in grocery stores. So that's localized in that production and distribution way as well. Yeah, pasta is just a big deal in general. It's such a strong symbol of Italian identity for us as well, authentically. And there's even a national World Pasta Day that it's every year in October. For this first stereotypes, we can comfortably say that it's definitely confirmed. Another common food and lifestyle stereotype refers to Italians drinking espresso like water all the time, every day. And in a way, yes, but it's more than just caffeine. Approximately 97% of Italians drink coffee every day, with espresso as the most popular type of coffee like format. This is according to the Associazione Italiana Caffè. So it's definitely more than just one of many drinks. It's a strong cultural habit. It's often what makes it peculiar, because coffee consumption, I think it's really growing across the board in the entire world. What makes Italian coffee consumption a little more peculiar is the way we get it. Often people get it al bancone, so at the bar counter, quite fast manner. Most Italians don't really stay there and sip their coffee when they are at the bar counter, not for a long time. And even if you're standing there at the bar, it may seem like a rushed way to drink coffee, but it's really a hugely normal habit. Something that maybe not many of you might know is that espresso is also a common end of meal drink that people actually have right at the end of the meal, even at a restaurant, as an alternative to, for example, digestive liquor. It's really just that little shot that it's suitable for all these little different situations. Again, in my house, I've always seen my parents having coffee at least 2 to 3 times per day. That was really the minimum. It could get to 4 to 5, depending on if they got coffee at work. But that's definitely normal. Italian espresso is completely different, for example, that the Starbucks American style coffee, not just for the amount of coffee. Of course, the espresso is short and strong, and it's about really getting it quick between a coffee break at work, or in the morning when I'm already in a rush to go to work, or at the end of the meal as a final little stop. On the other hand, the American style coffee, of course, is larger. You sip on it maybe while you're walking. That's completely different. And even in bigger cities in Italy, even though now there's Starbucks and there's other chains doing that kind of format, it's definitely not as common as it is abroad to have just that big takeaway coffee cup. But one of the most beautiful traditions tied to Italian coffee is definitely the caffè sospeso, suspended coffee. It originates in Naples, and it's the idea that when you buy your own coffee, you also pay for an extra cup that a future stranger can enjoy. It's really a little humble but cute gesture of solidarity and generosity, which is really part, especially, of the culture of Southern Italians. Traditionally, this could also happen really easily because of the price of the coffee being very, very affordable historically. However, recent increases in coffee bean prices have led to definitely a big increase for consumers. And in Milan, for example, the price of a little espresso has now reached approximately €1.90, and it could get even to €2. And this is becoming more and more normal. To me, it's really a shock. I remember when I used to really more commonly get an espresso for 90 cents. That feels like yesterday, really. Big Italian companies like Lavazza have like just publicly acknowledged that there is a challenge to the habits of Italian people getting their daily coffee. So really like some sort of kind of national society emergency, something that like I'm warning you, you guys will have to change your habits. So in summary, yes, cost of coffee may be escalating, but for now is really not impacting people's habits in Italy. So definitely this stereotype is mostly confirmed. Now let's move forward to a stereotype that I have to say sometimes it kind of annoys me when I see it reflected in some of the most common content related to Italians and Italian identity on social media in particular. And it's the idea that Italians are very strict about food rules. You know, it's this image abroad about Italians, our food culture, that it's very strict, almost sacred, with all these rules about how to prepare, eat, and serve dishes very peculiarly. And from the classic, absolutely no pineapple on pizza, to never put ketchup on pasta, which, by the way, don't put ketchup on pasta, please. But is this idea again that Italians adhere to, in general, like a rigid culinary guideline. And this is usually commonly thought of, even in Europe, like for in other European countries. But let's look at this a little deeper, because the answer is not that simple for this one. It's no secret that Italian food has really a super important and prestigious place in terms of culinary scene in the world. That's just undeniable. But there's something that many people just don't realize. It's this prestige is actually kind of recent. It's a recent development in broader history of Italian identity, because for centuries, Italian cuisine was regional, informal, and adapted to available local ingredients. There was no super culinary science behind it. It's whatever was available to people locally. And the idea of an Italian national cuisine really only emerged in the last century, more or less. And before that, again, there were more local specialties than anything else. And in fact, many of the dishes that now we consider quintessentially Italian maybe weren't even invented, as we know them today until the 20th century. For example, spaghetti alla carbonara. It's really always mentioned as this type of pasta, even in Italy, that you absolutely have to respect and do it in that specific way. Otherwise, you're like, you might as well go to hell. And honestly, I wouldn't even know how to make a real good carbonara. But to go back to what I was saying, it's a dish that has less than 100 years of history, and its most popular version likely didn't really match that original one. So it's even been changing and becoming something completely different. Actually, if you look at the past 50th century, if anything, there's been some sort of reinvention of traditional dishes. And it's something that it's explored in a very nice way in the book Denominazione di Origine Inventata, which highlights how many dishes that are now considered Italian staples were essentially created in the 20th. And these dishes are always considered timeless Italian food. And, that's why Italians are so rigid about it, because they're trying to protect, they're very proud of this history. But again, those traditions are relatively recent, and they really belong to a culture that was produced as some sort of Italian pop culture more. The annellini baked pasta that I was mentioning before, and today is considered a traditional Italian dish, but I have crystal clear my mom's voice when she hears that kind of talk, saying that when she was young, they didn't even have enough money, most of people in Sicily, to buy meat and to make ragu-based dishes. So the format might very well be localized, but it doesn't mean that it's this big, old, traditional recipe in the way we normally talk about it. It's actually quite recent, belongs more to the past 3 generations, maybe. But let's go back to what the stereotype is really about. That's some sort of crazy sense of pride towards food that makes act violently, exaggerately when you see that people is not eating things exactly in the way Italians do. This is definitely a peculiar part of Italian identity because it's that sense of pride that, on the one hand, Italians generally are known for not being particularly patriotic, but food is such a huge part of our identity. It's one of those few aspects that makes us all really united and agreeing on how great it is. And so it just makes everybody really proud. However, despite that and despite all these rich traditions, it doesn't mean that Italians actually stick for those rules themselves. Again, as I was saying before, I barely know how carbonara is actually made. And it's actually funny because there are things that we eat in Italy that foreigners have told me that doesn't sound Italian. And the typical example when I speak to Americans mainly is when I tell them that in Italy it's very common in any pizzeria, from the most luxurious to the really little takeaway in the corner pizzeria, to find pizza with French fries on top or pizza with tuna on top as a topping, in addition to tomato sauce and mozzarella. That's something that every time I mention it to Americans, they're always quite shocked. And that's when they tell me that sounds American. It doesn't sound Italian. But those are actually two of the most common types of pizzas that you can find in Italian menus overall. And that just to tell you that it really makes no sense to then, go and judge someone for going being all picky for the pineapple on pizza. That's why that's definitely a more far from reality kind of myth. I really don't think Italians are commonly so strict about food. It triggers some sort of pride, sure, but I think we also are more flexible than our parents and grandparents used to be with our food. So yes, Italians have strong opinions about food, but that's because food is in many ways the most important part of our culture as we perceive it. And however, the rigid street food rules that the world believes we follow, it's largely a myth. And the reality is that most Italians are flexible and we all eat more varied and ethnic food, especially in bigger cities. And so if you're enjoying a pizza with French fries on top or a cappuccino after 12 p.m., don't feel bad. You're just like another Italian. Another common thing that I see on social media, and that is one of the most widely circulated stereotypes about Italians, is that they all follow the Mediterranean diet and stay in shape really effortlessly. They follow this balanced, wholesome way of eating that supposedly keeps people fit, healthy, in shape, and, makes your life longer. First of all, let's look at what it really means. Alberto Grandi is an Italian food historian, and he provides this interesting perspective on the concept of this Mediterranean diet. He says that the term itself is some sort of post-World War II invention, and it was used to promote certain food products on a global scale. What we now refer to as the Mediterranean diet was basically created in the middle of the 20th century, and it was part of this big marketing campaign designed to boost the export of Italian, mostly agricultural products like olive oil, pasta, and wine. And I suppose it worked. However, this Mediterranean diet is actually based on a romanticized and oversimplified version of what people really ate, on a daily basis. It overlooks the fact that, for example, at its core, the diet was not universal in the sense that people were not eating all the same across Italy. Instead, it was much more divided. And the way they basically invented all these combinations of food that Italians supposedly were eating was just a mix of those products that they were trying to promote, and were connected to that idea of pure food, connecting Italians to their history and their ancient traditions in the Mediterranean. To understand why these stereotypes of Italians following the Mediterranean diet is misleading, we need to define what people usually think it includes. Typically, people talk about the Mediterranean diet, including fruit, whole grains, legumes, olive oil, fish, seafood, small portions of dairy, and moderate consumption of wine. So, in theory, this diet emphasizes high quality, processed ingredients, low consumption of red meat, and overall, a really balanced, healthy approach to eating. However, again, this is a very idealized version of a diet that doesn't reflect really people's habits in terms of the majority of Italians today. As Alberto Grandi also says, Italians do not longer follow this kind of diet in its strictest form because the industrialization of the country, of course, and food production, all the change of have led to a lot of changes in Italian people's eating habits in the past decades. We have lots more of high fat, high sugar, and heavily processed foods as well that have become common in the diets of many Italians. That Italy became also one of the big producers as well. All you need to think of is Nutella and how it's basically a highly industrialized processed version of the Piemonte gianduja paste. Italy is actually experiencing everything that other Western countries are experiencing, especially in terms of the rise of the consumption of fast food and sugary food, prepackaged food, especially among younger generations. Already in 2019, a report by the Italian National Institute of Statistics found that about 30% of Italians were classified as overweight, and the country was slowly increasing in the obesity rates. So there's a trend in Italy that matches with every other Western country in this sense. But if overall the Italian diet no longer is strictly the Mediterranean diet as people usually promote it for, there are still some regions where traditional eating habits persist and are associated with remarkable health benefits. And one of the most popular example really is Sardinia, particularly the area of Ogliastra, which is known for its concentration of people who live to be 100 years old or older. Sardinians have long been a subject of studies, even in the context of the blue zones, so those regions around the world where people live longer than average. The traditional Sardinian diet, which is still followed by many, especially among the older residents, is really a strong example of that kind of typical local diet that it's rich in plant-based food, legumes, grains, and matches a lot with that idea of Mediterranean diet. And research has also showed that combined with certain lifestyle factors, it contributes to that region's longevity, which is really exceptional. And Sardinians also consume moderate amounts of meat, which also matches with that traditional idea of Mediterranean diet, or should I say stereotypical Mediterranean diet. And it's probably one of the few cases where that kind of situation is still realistic. To sum it up, the stereotype that Italians all follow this Mediterranean diet and stay in great shape, there's no overweight people, and we can eat all the pasta we want because that's just how healthy our lifestyle is, it's really just a myth, and it's rooted in very outdated ideas of Italian food culture. Let's go to our fifth and last cliche about Italy, which is that Italy is run by the mafia. It's one of the most enduring and common stereotypes about Italy. And it's like this idea of the country controlled by the mafia as a shadow criminal force that operates in the background and pulls the strings of everything in Italy. It's obviously an idea that it's a little bloated maybe by pop culture, especially with big successes like The Godfather and The Sopranos, which, by the way, I love. I think The Sopranos are really a little piece of gold in American TV. But definitely they have made the idea of mafia and mafia people into this sort of symbol of power, honor, loyalty, and especially towards family. But the reality is far more complex. And when you look at the issues from an Italian perspective, you see that the stereotype is really just a simplification of what the reality is. Already starting from really what's in people's imagination, in people's mind when talking about mafia. In the United States, of course, again, because of those examples in pop culture, people think of Tony Soprano and that's all kind of cool. But in Italy, the mafia is not something to be admired or romanticized. It's really something dark and a destructive force, something repulsing, even if I can tell you what it feels to me. To me, it's really something disgusting that makes our culture more toxic. And the mafia's legacy is not one of prestige. It's a constant fight for survival, almost, against corruption, violence, and exploitation. The idea of what mafia is also been changing with time. In the 90s, for sure, mafia was at its most violent stage, and there were important figures like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino that have become these big symbols of the fight against organized crime. It's really part of my childhood, especially as a Sicilian kid. They were very, very often commemorated in public and in school. They were two incredibly brave men. They were both judges that really dedicated their lives and their work, their profession, to try to make their home a better place, essentially. But they were tragically assassinated by the mafia for their role in prosecuting its members. Today, however, mafia isn't just a group of violent criminals. It's really evolved in a more sophisticated and sort of business-like entity and organization that infiltrates legitimate industries and even the government, sure. So it's a lot less like mobsters and gangsters, and it's really more like this rooted, deeper kind of network that affects million people. All that I'm saying here is to try to explain why it's crucial to understand that Italy is not run by the mafia. While the mafia continues to exist in a lot of sectors, a lot of parts of our society, its power is not absolute, is not a peer to the government. That's not how we see it, and we don't see it as, something cool, something, a part of our population where we have anything to be proud of. Absolutely not. The mafia, it's something that we are definitely ashamed of. It's something that we would love to get rid of. And there are countless of Italians, judges, police officers, activists, everyday citizens who literally risk their lives to fight against mafia. These people are the few people, people like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino that I was mentioning before, that I would define like true Italian heroes in our history, and they definitely deserve respect and admiration. And I would hate that they contribute less to identifying Italy and who we want to be versus the mafia. The mafia influence still lingers, especially in the South. I think it would be incredibly interesting to dedicate an episode specifically to this topic. But yeah, the influence is still palpable, especially in the South, in everyday life, in people's opportunities, in the way the standard of life in the south of Italy is compared to the north, and in the kind of business the mafia is involved in, which is not necessarily something related to purely illegal matters like drugs and violence, but it's in a lot of legitimate businesses and operates in a much more intertwined with society way than people might think. So if you enjoyed this episode and you enjoyed diving into the true essence of Italian identity with me, don't forget to follow the podcast and to get in touch with me on Instagram, Blue Sky, X, and Facebook. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. If you're curious about the myth behind Italian culture and food, I definitely recommend reading the book Denominazione Origine Inventata, which also has a podcast version that you can listen to, and it's very, very interesting and insightful. I'll leave the link to the podcast in the description of this episode.